I'm Merv Schneider. I'm 100 years old and had a fairly good life. Born in the Mallee up in Wormeling, and aviation was in its infancy, and I was interested in aeroplanes. In 1934, an air race from England to Australia was sponsored by Robinson's chocolate factory. £10,000 was the winning prize, and there's no TV those days, and so we had to rely on the radio for the progress of the race, and I followed that as a young boy. That was in 1934, and I became interested in aviation. Fortunately, there was an aeroplane landed in Wimerling in about 1935, and I had a ride in that, and I was fascinated with aeroplanes. I came to Nhill in 1937, and Nhill was then an aviation town in its infancy, and quite a few aeroplanes were flying. So that kept my interest in aviation, and passenger air services were starting, and an aeroplane, the DC-2s and DC-3s were coming into Nhill to be refuelled, and I used to ride out from school and watch the activities, and that was in 1937, and 2 years later, as you all know, World War II started, and aeroplane activity became very active in Nhill, training flights from Laverton and Point Cook to Nhill, and we would come out from school and when they landed to refuel and do their lessons or whatever, we're going back. And in 1943, they started what was called Air Training Corps in Nhill. They started it all over Australia to train young people, 18 to onwards, to do the initial training to shortcut the passage into to flying. So we started with Nhill, the Air Training Corps, which I belong to, and they started the number 2 Air Navigation School here in Nhill to train night navigators to go to Europe to fly from England. I was very involved there. So in 1943, on my 18th birthday, after a little bit of trouble getting in because of a reserved occupation, I joined the Air Force and trained at Summers, and as a radio navigator and trained in Ballarat and Summers, Sale, Maryborough in Queensland, and then finally to operational training in Tocumwal, where I went on to fly the Liberator Squadron, number 25, City of Perth. Well, one of them is a picture of WWII, which is still flying. That's the one I learned to fly in. I learned to fly in an Avro Anson, which is this photo of it here. I trained in an Avro Anson and a Wacket and a de Havilland. But when you graduated and went to the squadron, you got into what I'd say were real aeroplanes, and we crewed up. We didn't have to fly in Liberators, had a crew of 11, had a heavily armed and big 4-engine plane, and that was a Tocumwal. So that's when you went from being a boy to a man, and you crewed up with a crew, whoever you thought. But I was told I was allotted to fly with a wing commander, Wedgwood, who was in the permanent Air Force. And when I looked up his credentials, he was 38 years old. And I thought, God, he's 38, he should have a walking stick. But once again, I was lucky because he was a qualified pilot. He was a highly professional, and he said, we're going to be flying safe. So, I had the good fortune of flying with a great crew. City of Perth Squadron in the photo, swan on our tail, pretty girl on her nose, and lots of armament here, there and everywhere. The Americans made sure that all their troops were well equipped, and they were there. So, and yeah, things went pretty well for me during the war. When I came home, still interested in flying, and yeah, I joined the Aero Club. Not in the beginning. I was about 1961, I joined the Aero Club here and learnt to fly. Took out a pilot's license, and yeah, I flew around Australia, and I kept flying until quite a few years ago. And still involved with the aviation centre out here that we built, the Nhill Heritage Aviation Centre, and yeah, I'm still involved and still very active, you know, where I can be. Yeah, I was 7 years old, I would say, and yeah, the thrill of feeling aeroplane rise into the air, and it was an open cockpit aeroplane. I was sitting on my father's knee. Yeah, I thought I was itching a bit. Yeah, no, that's I can still remember the flight. Yeah. Yeah, well, the first plane that landed in Nhill, and the Mr. Young that had a ride, he was an observer in the Army Air Corps in England, and yeah, he wasn't the pilot, so he had a connection with aviation. That was the story. Amy Johnson was her notoriety was the fact that she was a lady pilot, and raised, you know, the challenge of aviation in those days. So everybody knew about Amy Johnson, and she stayed in Nhill. But yeah, and when she lost her life, I was aware of that. But yeah, she was an incentive for us to fly. Yeah, she did, because Nhill was an active aerodrome. Amy Johnson came to Nhill, and because of Mr. Young, there was a tie. So yeah, she accepted the hospitality to stay with young people. Yeah, a Rainbow Man built an aeroplane himself way back in the early 1920s. He flew it, and he lost his life. So Rainbow had a contact with flying, and Amy Johnson, of course, being famous, I would say that's the tie, that the road called the highway was named after Amy Johnson being here. There's a Mr. Mackenzie in Nhill, and he was the news getter for the Nhill Free Press, and he was interested in aviation. He was the reason that Nhill has an aerodrome here. So he gathered all the facts of any aviation. So that would be recorded, I would say, because of Mr. Mackenzie. Yes. Arrival of an aeroplane was evident by this strange noise in the air. So everybody went out to look in the sky to see the aeroplane fly. But of course, when the war started and the activities here, night navigation, it was just bedlam at night, because the taking off and landing, and people they were objecting to the noise of aviation, but it was a fact of life, and bad luck, it continued on. It did. Well, the first air service to Nhill was 1929, in a pretty primitive aeroplane. But then when the DC-2s and 3s, Nhill halfway is the reason, the air services landed here quite often to take on fuel or bad weather. No navigation assistance these days much. So they would return into Nhill and stay overnight, and we'd have to transport them in. I was involved with that, into the hotels, and when the weather cleared in Adelaide or Melbourne, rouse them up and bring them out with their passengers, the crew there to fly. Yeah. And during the war, aviation training and the passenger plane, very, very active. Aeroplanes in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Yes. Yeah, well, aviation became very popular, and they were what's called barnstorming. pilots to earn money would come and give rides in aeroplanes, and they choose to fly. Nhill being an active aerodrome, they choose to fly out of Nhill on the day that suited them, but it didn't suit the community or the council, so they banned aircraft coming to Nhill on a Sunday. When I started the Air Navigation School, number 2 ANS, all young people, the town took them on as family. They become part of the community. And it wasn't long before we could come out to the aerodrome, or they would come in and take part. So they had dances and balls. They took part in that. People that trained in Nhill said what a wonderful place it was to train because it became part of the community. So they were taken into the heart. Yeah. Sometimes their families were here. We were building a hospital at the time. We were putting sewage in at the time and building the aerodrome. A lot of the homes had 2 families there for accommodation. So from 1939 to 1945, very, very active, busy town. But the relationship between the air school and the town was very, very good. Yeah, well, after I came home and you had to have money, of course, to learn to fly. I was at the garage and I studied aviation, and the garage decided that the Tiger Moth for the Aero Club was available for sale. So we bought it, and I learned to fly in that in 1960-61. I got my pilot's licence in 1960-61, and member of the Aero Club for many years, yeah. And the plane I learnt to fly in and fixed it is still flying. And now Len Creek's got the Tiger Moth, very similar. Len trained at the same time as I did, or a bit before. So the Tiger Moth is part of Nhill. One guy did start to build the one in Nhill, but the war started. He never completed that. But for the Air Training Corps, which I was part of, it was used for instruction purposes. But the one in Rainbow, it flew. Well, being born in 1925, the first 5 years or 4 years of my life, I had a good life. But in 1929, and the Depression hit overnight, the finances collapsed, and the world went into depression, and it affected Nhill and Wimmera very badly, and it was tough. Kids were coming to school with no shoes or socks. They were sending soup to schools to help feed the children, and it was very austere and pretty tough living. I was a bit fortunate that we were reasonably well off, but people were unemployed. They were travelling from Melbourne to Mildura to try to pick cool swaggies, to pick fruit. They used to clear the train off at Wimmera and leave 50 or 60 people trying to get to Mildura. It wasn't easy to see a doctor because people had no money, and that still continued on. By about 1934-5, things were picking up a little, but there was still unemployment, underprivileged people. But when this war started, unbelievable, the world changed. Everybody got employed, well, as it would work. You had to register to be, so that anywhere you were. And financially, the world boomed. We had a war which was bad, but the economy took off. And that stayed with us. After the war, there were demands for houses and activity. So we've seen a fairly good life up to now. I know it's pretty disruptive now, but the Depression years, where you wouldn't want to experience those again. People can't believe how tough it was. No. the women was always a little bit better off. They were tough. At the Mallee, it was tougher still because depression, the wheat prices were down, the conditions were bad, and the banks were foreclosing on them. Have to walk off the farm. They started a debt adjustment where a farmer had to pay to wipe his debt so much in the pound, down to, I can remember, down to 1 in 6 out of the pound. That's squared off his debts. But then they suddenly found out that they had abandoned farms, and banks then started to say, well, just stay on the farm to try and improve it. But with the depression and the droughts, the storms, they had what they call script buyers who would collude to how much they would pay for their wheat. I witnessed that. There were no silos then; it was all wheat stacks. That was an era that we wouldn't want to see again. It was tough. So that reflected on the community. The farmers were under stress. It reflected on businesses, and it in turn reflected on the lifestyle of people. To get an access to a doctor or something, food. That was, you can't believe what can happen in the financial world, but it did. Getting me in the Air Force, graduating to fly, and then going to operational training where we had Liberators, a big 4-engine aeroplane. It was the crew. That was an experience. Going to war wasn't so good, but coming home and then getting my pilot's license was good. And then I went to the Antarctic, and they were emergency. They were short of a pilot, even though I was only a private pilot. They got me to fly, so I had the experience of flying in the Antarctic. Did a few hours. Came home, flew around Australia, took a local doctor and a stock agent, and my memories of flying were pretty good, really. I enjoyed it. I loved flying. I had a very tolerant wife that she flew with me, but she didn't like flying in light aeroplanes. She didn't mind going on holidays in big ones, but I was very, very lucky. Yeah. I took the stock agent up to buy stock in Longreach, and I flew to all the cities, to all the capitals around Australia, and flew in the business, doing, buying vehicles or trucks, Albury and Bendigo. I visited most places. Yep. No, Little River was a satellite of Point Cook. We went to Point Cook in the air training course. So my Avalon started as a second major airbase. Was going to the air shows, and went to a couple of air shows at Avalon. So that's a commercial aerodrome. When we started our little family after the war, everybody was. There weren't such things as kindergartens. They were fairly new. And the Air Force Association, which was ex-flyers from the war, we decided that, perhaps we should have an Navy kindergarten. So we started a kindergarten from scratch. That was pretty interesting. Progressed from a little hall into a purpose-built kindergarten. I became involved with the RSL, of course, returned soldiers. I became involved with the aged care. We built it was an Apex project, but on the formative committee, I got involved with that. I was in most of the sporting clubs, had the privilege of leading nearly all of them. I just felt you needed to contribute if you're in a community. So I did, and had the support of a good wife, and yeah, we paved the way and saw a lot of development in the community. Some of the people in the community must have felt that it was I was fit to receive a recognition, and I got the Order of Australia. To me, it was embarrassing, but it's nice. But yeah, I've got records of a few achievements I've had. Looking back, yeah, but I wouldn't have got there without a good family. They supported me. I wasn't home when I should have been, but yeah, it was. Yeah. A lot of people contributed. I realised I've had not a privileged life, but a pretty good life, and yeah,